Welcome back to Podcast on the Brink. It's been a while since our last show. Had some vacation, took some time off with the offseason, but we're back and ready to go. Today's guest, Rocco Miller. You heard him during the season. One of the better bracketologists out there. Does great work at thebracketeer.org. Does a lot of great work in the offseason with non-conference scheduling. He's one of my go-to resources to try to figure out who Indiana will be playing next season. He's already provided a couple of those games for us. But Rocco, welcome back to Podcast on the Brink. Always good to talk college hoops with you. This is one of the, I guess, probably one of the few shows we're here on the first day of summer and we're still talking college hoops.
That's why I love you guys. Always good to be back on. Thanks for having me. And it's crazy to me because obviously I cover the sport all year long as a media member, going to games all over the country, different leagues, what have you. But I end up finding myself just doing the schedule stuff from the time the Final Four ends, all the way as long as it takes, which nowadays with the transfer portal, it's like all summer. I think last year we were still doing games in September. It was pretty crazy, which becomes a problem for me because I do have a hometown college football team I follow very closely. So I'd love to move on to football by Labor Day. But it's the nature of the beast, and things just get crazier and crazier each year because, I've found in scheduling teams with 3 or 4 open roster spots can be more dangerous than teams that have a set roster. Because if you commit to that early, you don't know what you're signing up for. And we saw a team like Southern Miss jump from like 321st or whatever they were 2 years ago to the top 60 last year. And they did that with just a few roster spots and some NIL money. So if it can happen at a place like Southern Miss, it can happen a lot of places. And so I think just a lot of those examples are continuing to make more and more coaches a little paranoid, a little risk averse. And even if they think they have games done, they're not signing the contracts, which makes guys like me have to be extra careful about putting games out to the public because they can easily blow up in my face and also upset the people that are actually playing each other. So it's a super interesting dynamic, but it keeps college basketball front and center all 365 days a year. And I think you and I can agree we love that.
Absolutely. I want to get more into the scheduling behind the scenes stuff and ask some specific questions about some of the teams Indiana is going to play and maybe some other Big Ten programs as we move along here. But first, I just wanted to ask you, obviously I had you on last year before the Kent State game in the tournament. Indiana goes on to beat Kent State. Then they lose to Miami, which Miami, what can you really say about that run other than it was one of the most impressive runs that we saw for any team in the tournament going to the Final Four. But then it's been an interesting offseason for Indiana. Obviously, there was expectations that Trace Jackson Davis would move on. Race Thompson, Miller Kopp exhausted their eligibility. Then you also have Jalen Hood-Schifino go pro, and you have players transfer out of the program. Tamar Bates, Jordan Geronimo. It's been really a lot of turnover with the roster, but they seem to have kind of landed on their feet, restocked the roster in a really solid way. There's still one spot that's not spoken for at this point, and we'll see kind of as the summer goes along. I don't think you can really say that the roster's set until the fall semester starts and everybody starts classes. So we'll see what happens with that. But just from your point of view, Indiana, they make the tournament the last 2 years. To me, they're kind of positioned well to maybe take a third straight trip to the tournament. Would you agree with that? And just kind of your overall thoughts on what their offseason's been like so far and what their roster looks like, in your opinion, going into next season?
I'd agree with that. Yeah. And I think the last, several months, the tournament itself, the tournament last March, it's such a beast in terms of matchups. I think Indiana fans breathed a sigh of relief that they were able to kind of coast in the second half against Kent State. Just an interesting nugget on that game real quick. I ran into Kent State's head coach, Rob Senderoff, at the Final Four, talked a lot about that game with him, and their star player, Sinkyu Carey, ended up with a bad knee that he injured actually like the day before the game, just tragically in their practice. So for the masses, unfortunately, that wasn't as good of a game as we all expected. But for Indiana fans, congrats, that was a nice win. But of course, it came with a slice of humble pie with the way Miami was just able to out athletic, not only Indiana, but man, what they did to Houston, I still think that's the most surprising and impressive result of the whole tournament was them just taking Houston to the woodshed. I think a lot of us that follow it nationally, we were like, Houston's the team that are almost anybody's going to have a hard time beating. Nobody's going to be able to run them off the court, and Miami did that to them. So maybe it took a week, but maybe Indiana fans felt a little bit better after seeing that. And then, of course, Miami continues winning and gets to Houston themselves. As for the offseason, yeah, there's been a lot of movement, but I think Indiana's done a nice job. The Hood Schifino situation, the kid is just so ridiculously talented. If he's getting the feedback, he's just got to go. It's just the nature of the beast with him. And then, Trace Jackson Davis, obviously we're recording this during the week of the NBA draft. So hopefully those guys will have good nights with the draft process. But with what's coming back, you have Xavier Johnson back. I think that's a big time. Pretty obviously, actually, like to have his experience, continuity, understanding of what Woodson likes to do in the staff, and Trey Galloway, who I've loved him since he stepped on the campus there in Bloomington, because he just hustles, he takes charges, he does all the little things that contributes to winning. I think if Indiana had one weakness last year, if you look at all the data, they just, they don't force many turnovers. They try to create bad shots, and they have good numbers there in terms of field goal percentage defense. But he's the kind of guy that can really inspire others around him. So to have him back, I think will help a lot. You look at McKenzie's coming in as a freshman, big time hype. I think, I'm not a big expert on high school recruiting, but everything I've read, I'm sure he's ready to contribute right off the bat. Expected to, in fact. Khalil Ware comes over from Oregon. Seen him play a number of times. That guy's got talent through the roof. So a little bit of more coaching, a little bit more, hopefully self-discipline for him. He ran into a few different issues while on campus at Oregon, and I think even before he got there. Hopefully for Indiana's sake, they're getting him at the perfect time where he's ready to calm down and really lock in on basketball. I don't think he'll have as many distractions there, hopefully. Him at 7 feet tall and his wingspan, I mean, he's a dangerous weapon. Obviously was a 5-star recruit in the high school circuit. And Peyton Sparks, I mean, I'm really curious to see what he can do, because I watch a lot of MAC basketball. We just talked about Kent State a second ago. And this guy was a beast and a load, and he really impressed me all last year and throughout his career there at Ball State with 2 different head coaches. And I think now he'll have his 3rd head coach in 3 years. I get concerned about bigs transferring up a level, but I do think the MAC is competitive enough, especially at the top 5 or 6, 7 MAC teams, to translate to the Big Ten. We'll see about that. Usually the guards have a little better time translating. The bigs are hit and miss. Sometimes they just flat out can't cut it at the level. But Sparks is a bulldog, and I think he can bring a lot to the table for Indiana, but I'm very curious to see how that plays out. And then, of course, you get Malik back, and some other depth pieces in through the portal that you mentioned. So I like overall, I do think this is clearly like a top 30 tournament level team, upside to be where they were last year, which would be a protected seed, top 4 range. And we'll see what they do with that last roster spot. You never know. We have the West Virginia thing going on. There's still some moving parts. The portal's pretty dry as it stands, but again, with that West Virginia situation and some other factors, that could quickly change. So we'll see how it wraps up.
You talk to a lot of coaches at various levels of college basketball. You mentioned the portal being dry right now, but is there still a sense among coaches that they could lose guys off their current roster via grad transfer and things like that? Or is it, do most coaches right now feel like their rosters are pretty much set and they have a good idea of who's coming back?
Yeah, it's an excellent question. So, it's certainly still paranoia for some of these guys. I don't know if you saw Ron Hunter at Tulane's tweet the other day, but he basically said if people don't stop poaching his players, he's going to come after them. And he made a very public tweet. That was probably Sunday or Monday of this week, would have been the 18th or 19th if you guys want to look that up. So just the fact that he's going public with it, I mean, I don't think anybody from Tulane has left yet, but that means his guys are getting calls. I'm sure it's going on. I assume it is. I think when I talk to teams, especially the mid-major level or below, They say all the right things, and we're working on scheduling games, but I think the roster is a huge part of scheduling. And so they typically don't dive in too deep with me. A few schools will, but from what I hear, I think most teams are, especially the schedulers, because I'm usually talking to an assistant. Some places I do talk to the head coach, but most of the time I'm talking to assistants. I think they're just focused on getting the schedule done and they want to be done with it. But at the same time, I mean, we see it almost once or twice a week where all of a sudden so-and-so's in the portal, so-and-so's in the portal. I think we saw a couple already this week. So it's definitely still going on. It's a tiered system, right? So if you're at the top of the pyramid, Indiana's close to that, if not at the top. And there's something you like down there in the middle that can really help your team. It's going to be really hard for that kid to not try to get out of it, no matter how loyal he is. I remember last year, I was around this time, I went to a Winthrop practice down in South Carolina, and DJ Burns was on the team. He was on the roster. The roster was done. Schedule was pretty much done. And all the coaches were fired up. They got DJ back. They might be the pick to win the Big South. A week later, all of a sudden, he's in the portal and he ends up at NC State. And, of course, helps NC State get to the tournament for the first time and may have saved Kevin Keats' job as part of that process. So you just never know. And I think that just being there and seeing that all firsthand, that will stick with me during this time of year because there's nothing really slowing anybody down from doing that. We'll see how the waivers play out this next year. Obviously, that's all going to be different. But I do think, I mean, just my gut tells me if you're in a Big Ten school or a top 25 level program, you're an asset to the NCAA's product. They're probably going to figure out a way to get that kid eligible. And I know that sounds kind of cynical, but it's really proven itself out over the years.
So with the scheduling, obviously you mentioned that you work with a lot of different programs trying to get schedules out. And I've seen this week, a couple schools, Ohio State, Michigan, have now released their full non-conference schedules. I think each school is probably at a different point in terms of where they are. Indiana, I think we've confirmed 8 of their 11 non-conference games, so they're closer to being finished than they are just getting started. But in general, the lay of the land right now in college basketball, are most programs finalizing their schedule for non-conference, or is it still kind of in flux for a lot of schools? Just I know it's kind of a loaded question because different schools are at different stages of things, but I'm just kind of curious like where we are in the process overall.
Yeah, good question. So I think Michigan today made either only the 4th or 5th in the nation to come out. West Virginia, Kansas were first 2. Another power school was 3, and then they're probably 4 and 5. Fairleigh Dickinson randomly threw out 8 of their games, but technically they still have a couple dates left. So yeah, it's pretty sporadic, but I think in general, the majority of the country is still in flux. I track every time I'm on a call with a different program, I'm trying to figure out at this stage of scheduling what open dates they still have. And so as I make more calls, that's how I can really be valuable for the teams is I can give them a list of teams to call that's looking for the same thing and that fit the formula. So at Indiana's level, the chances are those last 3 spots, they're probably going to find home games. And then, if I was talking to Indiana, which I'm not currently, I would send them teams that are looking to be what we would call bought in the business. It's a guarantee game where you pay them money to come, which is what they did with Wright State, Kennesaw State, and Gulf Coast thus far. And then Indiana, from their perspective, I work with a lot of schools kind of at the top of the sport, Indiana's level, where, depending on how analytical and in the weeds they want to get, they might want somebody like me to give them like 20 teams to look at and then go research them. And they'll select one of those 20 for a certain date for a certain reason. And that rhyme or reason is actually different based on each team's thoughts about their own team, thoughts about the rest of their schedule. So every single date is done purposefully, I guess I would say, especially at Indiana's level, because they will have a pick of a variety of teams. And, I talked to, I'll give you a few named examples that wouldn't mind me sharing, like Florida Atlantic, Dusty May. Last year, their schedule wasn't that strong, but what they did, I thought pretty smart was they would schedule 2 teams that really focus on zone defenses so their guys could see that. They focused on teams that had a star player, so they had Detroit Mercy come. They had, a team that comes at you in waves like Bryant play them. So coaches are always thinking about these different philosophies with scheduling, and that's why I find it so fascinating, because from one school to the next, it could be a lot different. So I think that's where Indiana's at. But I think as a landscape, we've got 32 conferences across the country, making up 363 programs. One independent team in Chicago State, and I think what ends up happening for the most part, just big picture, is the top of the sport, all the Power Fives will buy the bottom of the sport first. So that's, you might have seen Minnesota's schedule. They've got a lot of those bottom teams early. And that's those types of teams know where they stand. If you're talking about like an IUPUI or like a, LIU or, teams ranked in the low 300s, they know they're valuable. So they can actually have Indiana, UConn, Stanford, Arizona, whoever, all do a bidding war and get more money that way. So they're also strategic in their own way. So it makes it pretty fascinating. But those games get wrapped up pretty early in the process, in my experience. What we end up happening towards the end of the summer is all those middle conferences scrambling for games. And then they only have each other left to schedule. And then it becomes a battle of who wants to start at home. And all those teams need home games because they've usually got their money games done, but now they have no home schedule. So they're getting pressure from their AD. And I hear that a lot from conferences like the WAC, the ASUN, the Ohio Valley, the Summit League, where they just, they're in remote locations where even teams, like maybe their peer teams in terms of KenPom, still don't want to travel there because it might take them 2 flights or a long bus ride. And so that's where it gets pretty fascinating. Last year I had a lot of conversations with teams like Abilene Christian and Sam Houston and Southern Utah, all WAC teams as examples, but they just frankly couldn't get anybody in Division I to come out to their school. So they're luckily for them, the WAC has an alliance with Conference USA now, so they are going to be guaranteed home games. But those are going to be the teams you see take forever to release their schedule just because they, quite frankly, can't fill the couple of home dates.
How closely are, and I'm not talking specifically to Indiana, but the major conference schools, obviously, I know some maybe are more serious about it than others, but, in the past, it's always been a joke that Iowa, they'd schedule like 3 or 4, 5, 6 teams that are KenPom 300 or higher. And when I was looking at the Indiana schedule, I'm always like, it's best to try to get in that middle ground, like the 150 to 225, 250 range, and try to avoid the teams that are 300 plus. Maybe have a couple of those. Maybe it's unavoidable, but ideally you have none of those. But you just mentioned Minnesota having a ton of those games. Obviously, Ben Johnson's probably trying to pad his win total to, make himself still employed after next season. But how closely are these schools looking at the trade-off between buying a win and also hurting their non-conference strength of schedule? I understand you have to buy some wins. That's just part of how it works. But you obviously don't want to play 351, 352, and 353 all in the same season, right?
I would agree with that for at-large purposes, yeah. And I think, I think Indiana's been smart about that they've never really been in this Woodson era, at least. They've never been at risk of non-conference strength of schedule dismissal. It's really, I like that metric a lot. They changed it just a couple of years ago to the net non-conference strength of schedule versus the RPI non-conference. And as funny as it sounds, I do think the RPI version of non-conference strength of schedule is stronger because it grades your strength by wins and losses more, whereas the net one is just based on your net ranking. So you could have a great net ranking, but it also still be under 500. And so, some of that is what it is. But with that said, now it's also, some of it's been ignored. We've seen teams have, I'm trying to remember the teams, but like TCU got a 6 last year. They were, I want to say, like in the 300s, if I remember right. Drake got into the play-in. And I'm glad they did. I thought the rest of their resume deserved it. This was a couple of years ago when they did the tournament in the bubble and they played Wichita State. Their non-conference was over 300. That was one of the first bubble teams I've ever seen get in with a 300. But Drake was not a power conference team. They did all they could to schedule, and they had Loyola Chicago in their league that year, which was a top 10 team. So they were able to prove themselves a little bit that way. But we did see last year Clemson kind of played themselves out with a 342. Wake Forest the year before with a 341. And so if you anticipate you're going to have a bubble type season, you got to be smart about that and not do it. Both Wake Forest and Clemson, as examples, went out the next year. Clemson's doing it this year, Wake last year, and made sure they didn't run into that situation again, scheduled a lot harder. So they had to learn the hard way. And I think here in the Big Ten, Indiana, I think it's smarter from a basketball perspective to go for that 150 to 250, because between Gulf Coast, Wright State, Kennesaw, they're not the bottom of D1. They all have something to like. Gulf Coast beat USC in their opener last year, ran out of steam with some guys going down in January. So their end of season record didn't look good, but coming out of non-conference, they were still kind of in the hunt for an at-large just because they had that USC win. I think they only had a couple losses. So they definitely got talent. Wright State's always good with Scott Nagy. They're going to show you a lot of different looks, and they always have good shooters and a good big man. And then Kennesaw is coming off the best year in program history. And although 3 of their starters went with Coach Abdul Rahim to South Florida, Terrell Burden, who's like Mr. Kennesaw, and the guy that put him in the NCAA tournament with free throws, he's coming back. And there's a lot of buzz with their new head coach coming over from Alabama. So I think Indiana is smart to play those games because I don't think they're at a huge risk to lose them at home. And at the same time, they're going to learn something from those experiences, and it's going to potentially prepare them for some stuff they might see in Big Ten play, which are, when really the rubber meets the road, right? Even with Harvard down there in Indianapolis, I'm sure with Harvard's style and their approach to basketball will be much different than what they've seen in some of these other matchups. So I like the way Indiana's doing it. If I was a coach, I would want to test my team, especially if we were a top 30 talented team. There's really no reason to go all the way down to the 300s to schedule games. Because even in the Big Ten, if you lost, let's say one of those ones I listed, you have plenty of time to make up for that. With a couple big wins or a couple big road games, that can easily make up for one bad Q4 loss.
Yeah, I mean, just looking at the 4, I guess, games right now that you would consider bye games, Harvard, if you look at Bart Torvik, is the lowest ranked of those 4 teams, but Florida Gulf Coast and Wright State and Kennesaw State are all ranked somewhere, I think, in the top 160, 170. So overall, it seems like Indiana's off to a pretty strong start in terms of strength of schedule. Filling out those last 3 games, it seems like most of the marquee events now nationally have kind of been spoken for or announced at this point, barring any unforeseen announcements here late. What do you expect in terms of the rest of Indiana's non-conference schedule?
Alex, yeah, so good question. I think, the last 3 spots, we're playing a little bit of a guessing game here, but each of the first 2 years, Woodson was there. He hosted the Hoosier Classic, which always had a SWAC level team. I think Jackson State the first year, last year, Jackson State again. So, we'll see if I would imagine there's probably at least one of those in there, just if they have a tight date. That's an easy team to plug in. Make sure you're not risking a loss. That's where it can start to make sense. It also always made sense with those 2 seasons because they packed those 3 games into like a 5 to 6 day span. So, but besides that, I would hope they could schedule a couple more teams like the trio of Wright State, Kennesaw State, and Florida Gulf Coast, because those 3 teams all bring something to the table that Indiana's going to learn from, and maybe they'll even be in a tight game in one of those. So we'll see. I'm always rooting for better games. I think maybe some of the fans are too, but at the same time, you also don't want to risk losing. So maybe we'll see a couple more of the bottom feeders and then one more good, solid one. But we'll see. And there also is a chance. I'm not familiar with any neutral court events that Indiana is directly involved with, but there is a lot still being planned. So we'll see how that plays out. The majority of the stuff that's out there, though, is on December 16th or 17th, and that's a date that Indiana and Kansas are already playing on. So most of that, there's really no mystery because there's no chance they're playing in any of those. Outside of that, there's a couple things brewing on the 2nd of December, and there's a couple things brewing on the 9th. So Indiana OD has Auburn on the 9th. So it would be a little surprising to me if they took up any of those. Perhaps the second they could, but it's going to have to be a marquee opponent, I think, because I think when Indiana goes and plays those games, they want to play like in Arizona or, even in Auburn or Kansas, which is what they've been doing.
Yeah, the other thing there you also have to remember is the 2 early Big Ten games, and they could also fall on that weekend of the second too. So that may take Indiana or other Big Ten programs out of contention for one of those spots. One thing that is always fascinating to me, and one reason I like to see the contracts for these non-conference games, is the amount of money that exchanges hands on some of these non-conference buy games. I've always looked at Indiana's, and usually it's between 85, 90,000 all the way up to 100, maybe even a little bit over 100,000. What kind of money is exchanging hands typically in these types of deals? Is that the higher number? One of the higher figures that you'll see, or are there schools paying more than that?
Yeah, no, I think it's rare to see over 100. Usually, if I see 100 flat, I'm always like, okay, they got big money to go there. I would start to consider that big money for basketball. Obviously, in football, it's like astronomical. But I just heard a story. I haven't seen it. I just heard this last night, actually, that a team got paid 120 this year. So we'll see if I get a hold of that one. But that would be the highest I've seen in the last couple of years, especially since the COVID shutdown. The money got a lot drier. Obviously, athletic departments were overspending on things and trying to cut back. And, even Big Ten schools that would usually pay 95, 90 were going down to 75, 80 just to get through a couple of years. But that was the going rate. And then it affected the marketplace just like anything else across the rest of the landscape. So that meant like Mountain West teams who might pay 85, 80 on a normal year, they were going down to 75, 70, and the trickle down effect that way. So I call it buyers and shoppers. It's because it's no different than a regular marketplace. So shoppers are starting to get more of what they want now. I think some of those Minnesota ones, from what I heard, were 100 or even up to 105. So they're obviously very interested in making sure they get those specific teams to come there. So it's a very intentional schedule that the Gophers are doing, and for obvious reasons. You called it out point blank. Coach Johnson needs to make sure he gets some wins, gets that team somewhat confident for Big Ten play. They're obviously in an uphill situation. So, but I think what you've seen is pretty spot on. The SEC and the Big Ten, of course, have the most resources, so I typically see the highest numbers in those two leagues.
At what level does it go down to in terms of teams paying for games? And then, is it mid-majors paying too, and are they paying significantly less? Or where's like the cutoff point to where obviously there's some teams that are playing like exclusively these games, but they also play some home games. I assume they're not, from the lower conferences, they're not buying games at all at that point, right?
It depends. It's not a straightforward answer. So a lot of schools, I'll give you an example. Look at the CAA right now. The CAA is all over the place. You've got a very wealthy private school like the College of Charleston. They can go and buy games, no problem. They host the Charleston Classic every year. They've got money flowing through that athletic department. There's a big reason why Pat Kelsey took that job. It's a great job for that level. It's probably the best job in that league. And, there's a couple other spots that aren't bad spots either. Like, Northeastern's a good spot. And, maybe a couple others could reach Charleston down the road. Hofstra's obviously a pretty good job, but they don't have the same kind of funding. So Hofstra has to go out and get buy money, even though they can compete with Charleston for a championship. You look at like HBCUs joining that league with North Carolina A&T and Hampton. They're obviously fighting from the bottom. They're barely above the rest of the MEAC HBCUs, which is how they were able to get out of the MEAC and into the CAA. Hampton came through the Big South. But yeah, so it's all over. You can't just chalk it up to a league. You got to look at each individual school. Out here in the West Coast Conference, I think you guys are very familiar with St. Mary's. They have the money to go buy all their home games if they wanted to. They do very well financially. Every school out here is a private school in that league. but that doesn't make them equal. If you're Pacific, you still need money. So Pacific goes out and gets money. If you're, I don't know, even San Diego does pretty well financially, but like even them, they have to go play road games. It's Gonzaga's at the top. St. Mary's is right there next to them at the top. And then it's kind of everybody else doing something a little bit different. Santa Clara plays a good amount of neutrals, even though they have a good amount of money. So it really comes down to each individual school's budget. And even within a league, hopefully that example paints a broader picture, because even within a league, that can be different from one team to the next, even if those same two teams are competing at the top of the league for a championship.
Last thing before we get you out here, I wanted to ask you, and obviously Indiana fans are interested in this because he's an Indiana grad. Dusty May, the run that they had to the Final Four, I know he's somebody that you know pretty well. One of the fascinating things to me kind of in the aftermath of this is, you know, I guess I wasn't necessarily shocked to see that he stayed at Florida Atlantic, but the way he was able to keep that roster together with all of what's going on right now in college basketball, you see guys basically just taking, you know, I know a lot of people don't want to call it pay for play, but in many instances, that's what it is. You know, guys taking NIL deals to go somewhere else. And I'm sure there's been financial resources down there at Florida Atlantic, and they've probably are kind of riding the wave of that run. And there's a lot of people willing to do deals and things like that. But, you know, to see how well he's kept that together was pretty surprising from afar. Just what's your sense of, I guess what was your reaction to see him stick around there? You know, he obviously could have probably cashed in and gotten a better job, at least on paper, after this, and also just what he was able to do in terms of keeping that roster together. I think kind of speaks a lot about maybe what the culture that he's built there and what the players think of him being willing to stick it out and try to make another run next season.
Yeah, you nailed a lot of it. I mean, I think it all had to go down the way it went down for it to be like this. I think the long run into April knocked him out of a lot of jobs that he probably would have taken. To be quite honest, that's just my opinion. You know, if they get knocked, they played Memphis in the first round. I said it then, I'll still say it now. I thought the winner of that game had a really good chance to go to the Final Four, and the loser was a very good team to be knocked out early. And they win that game on basically Nick Boyd's layup with a second to go. If they lose that game, I'm pretty sure Dusty's getting at a press conference the next week. And I get there would still be maybe a small percentage he could stay, but I think that run did so much for the school, Florida Atlantic University, because I was with them in the Garden for the regional, so I was with them every day for 4 or 5 days. And I could just feel like every day the energy, you know, when they won the Sweet 16 game against Tennessee, they rallied back. They were down big in the first half, totally dominated the second half. The amount of people that were there from Florida Atlantic on the Sweet 16 night to all the people that came up from Florida for the Elite Eight game and took over half the Garden, I was like, okay, they've got it going now. And then they go to the Final Four, and I was down there all week. And, you know, they were well represented. It was like they were almost like a power school by then, just because the support was overwhelming. And they were able to they started an NIL collective, you know, before last year called Winning in Paradise. You guys have probably seen that. But I just think all the amount of money that was in there, even through January or February, since that time, since the run, it's gone up so high. Like, I don't know the number. I don't have any idea what the number is. Obviously, it made it feasible to get two guys that were on the cusp of going to the NBA or could certainly transfer up to the highest levels of college basketball, John L. Davis and Elijah Martin, convince them to stay. I think the rest of the core, even Golden, Rosado, Greenlee, Boyd, etc., they were all holding out hope that those guys would come back. I don't know what would have happened if they didn't. Maybe they would have stuck it out and just found two guys to replace them. But I think Dusty was looking at that, and I think Dusty was confident. You know, he could have still interviewed a few other places even after the run, but I think he was confident at that point, especially when he looked at the landscape, that, you know what, there's definitely no better place than this, especially for next season. Now, we're going to see Greenlee and Gaffney both be seniors next year, Weatherspoon as well. Obviously, Martin and Davis will have pressure again to go pro. So maybe it all moves around next year. But I think what they've been able to do just since the Final Four, I mean, it's going to be impossible to get a ticket there, even for their regular games, let alone their big games. We're talking right now to ESPN about doing a college game day there when Memphis comes. So hopefully that will happen. That will be magnificent. They had like 4 tailgate parties on Saturdays last year that were pretty wild. They're going to have those probably even more than 4 this year. They announced that 3-team series with College of Charleston and Liberty, which will be great for mid-major basketball. That's all going to happen in Boca this year. So anyway, I'm just telling you, at this point, it's like, my God, they're like a preseason, probably at least top 20 team, but they could be top 10. We don't know yet. And they're going to a better league. You factor all that together, and it's just like, how many more Power 5 jobs can be, at least for next season, and especially with it being a year-to-year sport, how many more Power 5 jobs could be that enticing? I thought maybe Notre Dame, but they went with Shrewsbury. Obviously, Indiana would be probably impossible for him to turn down if that ever opened up. But I think at this point, man, they're built to. We'll see how this year goes, but if it goes like last year, they might be a mid-major power for years to come, based on all the revenue being generated and the buzz, and they're eventually going to build the new arena, which they've needed. So we'll see. It could be long lasting. It'll be fascinating to follow, as it was last year.
Rocco, always good to talk to you. Thanks for all you do with the non-conference scheduling. I know a lot of us would be in the dark in terms of who teams are playing. I've always told people to follow you on Twitter and not just for the Indiana games, but you're constantly tweeting out matchups from different conferences, and it's fun to watch it all come together. So thanks for that.
Anytime. Yeah, appreciate it, Alex, and love coming on your show. Love the work you guys do. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody, for listening to this episode of Podcast on the Brink. We'll be back soon with another episode. As always, if you enjoy the show, leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcast or a rating on Spotify, and we'll talk to you soon on another episode of Podcast on the Brink.